conducted for Inverkeithing People Making History Oral History Project. My name is Dr Sue Morrison and the respondent is George Hastie. This is the 6th of November 2021 and the interview is taking place in George's home in Montrose. Thank you very much for agreeing to be interviewed, George. For the record, would you please confirm your name?
George Hastie.
And what is your age or just your year of birth?
I'm 75.
Thank you. Where were you born, George?
In Inverkeithing, in Fife.
And when did you leave there?
In 1970.
Excellent, thank you very much. Would you tell me about your early life, please, with your family?
Yes, well, I grew up on a farm, which was actually what we would call a town farm. It was actually built on the west wall of the old town. And our garden was back to back with buildings on the high street. In the next garden over, if you went down there, they had a stone marked 1612 and another little carved stone and another little lozenge with names and dates. And that was the back of the Gala Tower, which was built in 1612 on the main part of the high street. That was demolished in 1890 and became the Clydesdale Bank. But having these things, and of course having a high street that had 17th century houses and one or two forestairs like you have in Crail, it sort of sparked my interest in history. Also, my uncle had a shop on the high street and he had a store which was in a building marked 1688. And this building had very, very small windows compared with other tenements of that kind of era. And I found out much later that there was a mini ice age for about 30 years. So the person who built that built it with smaller windows to keep the place warmer. It just shows that variations in climate aren't a new thing. So I grew up in a small community. I could walk along the road in front of our house to the school, which was about 5 minutes away. And I attended the church and Sunday school on the high street. It was a very old building with a 14th century tower. We had a minister there who'd been there since 1938, so he knew everybody and quite a lot about the history. And then former minister Dr Stevens had written a history of the borough, but he was very academic and he had written long lists of Sassines and owners of tenements, not descriptions of buildings. When I was about 14, I became interested in photography and I wanted a camera. So I wanted to go and photograph some of these 17th century buildings because I knew that some of them were going to be demolished. This was part of the town getting itself tidied up. At the end of the war, there had been a great demand for housing and Colin Morris, a local builder, had gone to the town council and said, "You have a lot of 17th century buildings in the town which you own. If you let me, I'll give you a kind of basic price to put a lavatory and kitchen and electric wiring into each of them." It was a good idea and it would have been a contract for the builder, but of course housing was very essential and the government was offering grants to build new houses. And that affected our family. Because as I said, we were on the fringe of the town looking west up the hill, probably the Gala Hill that's marked in old title deeds behind the Gala Tower, and Gala means high. And in front of the house there was a track and a stackyard and some wooden buildings. That was before I was born, or just about the time I was born. By 1947, that had been bought by the council and a big road was put up going right up the hill. It's called Dees Road, and side roads, and 84 prefabs were built there. That could be done with a government loan or a government grant, and that got people housed. Then in 1952 they built another 120 house scheme at the top of the hill. It was Hillfield Road and Crescent, and that was one of the steepest housing schemes in Britain. It really is difficult to get up to that high top, but they managed it. Nowadays a builder wouldn't look at it really. They they'd have gone in from the top of Hill Street maybe. But anyway, that in a sense changed our life because we had all these fields in front of the farm going up the hill. These were called the Borough Roods. By and large, they were strips of land roughly 8 ells wide and about 120 ells long. It depends. A rood is like an acre. It can be any shape, but it's square meterage that really counts, or square ellage as it would have been in the 17th century. So anyway, I didn't know it, but we had title deeds to all of these roods in our vault, in our safe in the bank. And later on I was able to look at all these strips and see who had owned which. But from my point of view, suddenly, well, I never knew this as a child, but while I was still a baby, the wide open spaces in front of us of hillside became a big housing area, and a concrete road was built along. And the town had thought of developing there. A new school had been built further along, and there were 2 gates going in from that track, even before it was asphalted, because they realised that one day houses would be there. But during my time, well, at the time I was born, practically no one would have gone into the school from the west side. They'd have gone in from the east side opposite the church. So I started photographing these 17th century buildings. One had a 4-stair and a little courtyard at the back. And I started speaking to older people, and they told me a little of the lore of the place. And that's when I began to get interested in history. And as I grew up through my teen years, I got talking to other people, and they shared what they had with me, and that started what's now my archive. One of the strange things when you go around as a teenager taking pictures, you get old people who say, "Oh, don't waste your money on that. These are just old buildings." And that was very much the attitude in those days. But along the coast, the little town of Couros was having old buildings renovated by the National Trust. And the little houses scheme was really an eye-opener to me. I love going to Couros anyway. And when I saw these 17th century houses renovated, cleaned up inside, and done on very simple lines, simple plain walls, whitewashed. The palace was done in this kind of ochre colour, which was the colour of merchants, and wealthier people. It really was very attractive. I've always been interested in architecture, and this really sparked my interest. So I started photographing different buildings from that time on. Eventually I got myself a 35mm camera when I was 17. Other people spent money on bikes or scooters. I was quite sure I wanted a camera, and I saved up. One of the things about living on a farm is you're not poor, you have plenty of food, but you're not rich in cash terms. So farmers always live simply between harvests. After harvest, Gavin Sprott used to say that sailors were misers compared with farmers, because after harvest, farmers would spend when they had a little cash to flash. But my parents really were quite good. They didn't sort of tell me off for spending so much money on film. And a friend of theirs had an old uncle who was quite a keen photographer, and he said, "I've got something that might be of use to you. I used to take a lot of pictures. These are negative albums." And he gave me a little booklet of 100 folios, 1 to 100, where you put your 120 negatives in and then wrote the index on the front. And all my 120 pictures, I had one of these cameras too, were indexed like that. That systematic way of doing things was also an eye-opener. It was just a little nudge, but it gave me the idea that it's not enough to take pictures. You have to put the magic words on the back: when, where, what, why, how. All these questions have to be answered. And the number of people that say, "Oh, I've got old photographs of the family, I mean to go through them." And I say, "Well, go through them now and put when, who, why, where, now, because otherwise people won't make anything of them. So you must always do that, at least put a date on a picture. I went off to college, and that kind of widened my interests, and during that time several things sort of happened. First of all, I met someone who was interested in industrial archaeology. Industrial archaeology was something new to me, and it taught me to be systematic in reporting things like water mills, overshot, breastshot, undershot, diameter of wheels, etc. That was good. And I also ended up for about 5 days excavating buildings around a lead mine at Lead Hills, which was a very, very good introduction into how to do archaeology carefully and how to realise that everything is important. Something you dig up, you can't say, well, that's a funny bit of metal, and throw it aside. You've got to think, where did it fit? What was it? And that's the same when you're looking at stones and things that you might find on a demolition site. You know, they give you a clue to what the building was. The other person that was important was Eric Simpson, who came to live in Dalgety Bay. Now, Eric is a historian. He taught at Murray House, and he also has written a lot of books about the history of the area. Dalgety Bay, the new town that was built in '67, and also holiday towns and the Great North Road going north up to Caithness. Eric was, again, a systematiser, and while he approved of what I was doing, you might say that he was a tutor that always had "could do better" written on anything I submitted. He would say, yes, that's fine, but what's this and why that, and what does that mean, and where does that fit into the bigger scheme? Now, I sat through history lessons at school where we dealt with the Corn Laws and people getting the vote, and it didn't mean a thing to me. I didn't do very well in history. It was my worst subject. But as soon as I got out and about seeing buildings and people who could interpret buildings, or factories and people who could interpret the remains of old machinery, it suddenly all came alive. When I graduated, I was away from Inverkeithing for a few years, and then I was minister in Edinburgh for about 14 years. I could come back now and then to Fife to visit the family, and when I did, I often photographed any changes around the town, but that was rather episodic. But later I came to Cowdenbeath, which is just 15 miles up the road, so it was very easy to come down for a day if I knew that something was happening, or even going to the Highland Games at Inverkeithing, or the Hat and Ribbon race, which took place every year in the High Street. That's an old race going back to the time that herdsmen came into town on the first week in August. Or going to the Lammas Fair, which also took place every year in the square in Inverkeithing in the first week in August. I could come down for these things. People would know me and meet up with me, and I felt much more connected. When I moved up to St Cyrus in '98, I decided to put a great deal of my pictures into various collections. I gave a lot to Dunfermline Library and Museum. I gave some slides and information to National Museum of Scotland. And as well as that, I also gave some ephemera from my own school life, and a lab book, a book of essays, these little things, the kind of things that people have in their attic and throw away. Now, I realise you can't keep absolutely everything, but there are one or two important things, and Opie, for instance, started quite a big museum of ordinary wrapping for ordinary household things, and people can now go there and marvel over packets of Rinzo and Oxo cubes and say, oh, I remember when we had these. A similar thing happened when we went to the Highland Show, or when I went to the Highland Show later on. There was always a museum tent showing things like horse harness, horse brasses, a butter churn, and maybe a seed barrow. And there were always people standing there looking in puzzlement saying, that doesn't belong in a museum, I was using that yesterday. Because this was the period in the 60s when horse was getting away to tractors. I had a horse on the place when I grew up. Prince still did some work pulling carts and just general work round about the place until he grew old. And then he was replaced with 2 tractors, and then later with 2 other tractors. And Dad was a potato merchant, and so we had a big lorry, and we had a shooting brake, you know, a family car that could also take 2 or 3 crates of cabbage in the back to fill an order. We were very lucky in the sense that my grandfather came there in 1916 to the farm because he was the younger of a group of brothers, and they all rented land in East Lothian, and the lairds of course wouldn't sell. And my grandfather came to Inverkeithing because he had the chance to take over the small farm with 40 acres and the chance to rent a few more roods and to make something of it as a market garden. Of course, the First World War came and went, and 2 things happened. Sadly, at the end of the war, a lot of laird's sons had died in the trenches because they were officers, and the estates wanted to, or had to, sell up their land. And so my grandfathers were going to use this in inverted commas, lazy brothers who didn't have the enterprise to get up and go, suddenly found that prime pieces of East Lothian were theirs for the signing up. Now, not for the taking. They had to pay it up, and they had to work hard for many years and live with debt. But once they did that, they owned farmland in some of the best parts of Scotland. Meanwhile, we had a recession. The new town of Rosyth, built 1912, was part of the draw because here was a ready-made market, a brand new dockyard, a brand new town, all these people with mouths to feed, and ships coming in with men on board needing potatoes and cabbage and carrots. By 1920, I'm told, if you went to Dunfermline Council and said, I'm looking for a house in Rosyth, they would hand you a bunch of keys and say, look down the road and say, do you want one on the left side or the right side, or which garden you like. Some gardens had plum trees, some had apple trees, and you could more or less choose your house. Now that's a wee bit of an exaggeration, but really the big new town, which was to be the great white hope for the area, was in the doldrums, as was everything else. However, we got through the 30s, and Dad worked hard, and by the end of the war, when we lost our yard outside, our stackyard, he was able to build a new modern set of sheds, not a steading, but really proper set of sheds with 5 bays, so we could get a lorry in, a tractor in, trucks in, and space to sort potatoes. And also he put in a new house there for his sister, so that was fine. We were still up and running. And he also rented 100 acres of Belnow's farm, which was further out of the town on the North Road. I don't know what he paid for that, but I know that he said when he told an old farmer what he was paying per year, just in rental, he was never going to own it, the man kind of sat back in his chair and gasped. But you see, times had changed. These roods, eventually we owned a few of them, and we also owned a 40-acre field behind the town, just beyond Hillfield. It's between the Forth Road Bridge and Perth, which is important, because in '62 we got a letter from the Forth Road Joint Board saying, we wish to purchase your 40-acre field with a view to building an approach road to the bridge. Now, a 40-acre field is a very big piece of land, but imagine it on top of a hill, and imagine that you want to put a highway down at that level you then have to have an angle of repose, which, believe it or not, comes up to about 36 acres at the top for that length of highway. So our field is the imaginary dome over the approach road as you approach the bridge today, just between the last junction at Rosyth and the bridge entry. So that fairly knocked us flat in a way. That's the trouble with town farms. You're always being overtaken by the town. It reaches out and it encroaches. There were other farms, of course. There was along at Dalgety Bay, there was Seafield Farm. I used to like going to Seafield. It had a date stone on the steading and on the house, 1857. And that was interesting because our house had a date 1857 as well. And it was obviously a cottage, and the upper bit had been built later because the windows were in a different style with this dated stone. So round about 1857, something had happened to make agriculture more useful and lucrative. Sure enough, when I read the history books, I found out the background to that. Seafield Farm was out in the country. A little railway ran down to Fordle village, from Fordle to St David's village, which was a pier for exporting coal for Fordle Estate. It was idyllic. You could walk from Inverkeithing round Preston Crescent, past the quarry, and along to St David's as well. But it was really peaceful. And then, in '67, the new town of Dalgety Bay started. And now a big road sweeps past that. The Fordle Railway is away. Oh, and the farmhouse is away as well. I thought they might have kept it as a hotel or a restaurant, but no. And poor St David's, beautiful harbour. If they had made berths for yachts, it would have been idyllic. But nobody thought about that in those days. And it would be nice to have one or two of the old buildings as a seaside cafe as well. But no, Dalgety Bay is completely new, although there are one or two things, including a burial cist from the Neolithic time, and the old chapel, and also the courtyard from Donnybristle House. But Donnybristle House was also a place I walked to. It had beautiful ironwork put in by the owners, now replaced. It's up at Doon now, but a replica has been put in. But there were all these historic things round about the town which inspired me and made me want to record the passing scene.
Okay. George, would you tell me about your childhood in the 1960s, please?
Yes, in the 1960s things were changing, and I think everyone would agree that there was a new generation coming up with different ideas. It was a time of hope and a time of progress. Later on, Harold Wilson was to coin the phrase "the white heat of technology." Was it Harold Wilson? Yes, it was. And we had a book in our French class which, when they dealt with the future, said "Énergie atomique sera tout." Atomic energy will do everything. It's a pity they didn't do that because it's very green and it isn't as dangerous as people think. And if we had built some decent nuclear stations in the 1980s, we wouldn't be in the pickle we are now, but that's an aside. Yes, fashion and swinging London, no, that didn't come to us in the 1960s. The nearest I saw of that was a friend of mine had left school at 16 and he'd gone to work in the paper mill, so he had an income. And he was also interested in photography. And very soon he had a better camera than I had, and he had a moped scooter. He was very much a mod. But that was, and he had his own record player. And I didn't. Radio was always my thing. I said that farmers are usually fairly canny, and Dad went to auction sales, and one day he brought home a little wooden case radio, very old, not an ancient one, but a more modern one. And that was a great thing, having a radio in my room. Never a television. We didn't have a television until 1966. And then it was only because some neighbours had taken pity on us. I couldn't understand how we couldn't live without a television. And they brought their old one when they got a bigger screen. So we got their 17-inch, when they got the 21-inch. What they didn't realise was that on a farm, you didn't really have time to watch television. There were things to do. And I had a part-time job at the weekend looking after pigs, feeding them. And that was great because I had an income now, and that helped my photographic budget. The house was comfortable, and it had a coal fire in a metal range in the living room. That had been a cooking range, and you could actually have put a pot on top and kept it simmering if you wished. But we built on a new kitchen with an electric cooker and so on. We had the next door garden, as I said, was back to back with the bank. And one day, on a very frosty day, there was a tremendous roar and rattle, and we found that as the frost in the wall had begun to melt, the whole rubble wall had collapsed just opposite our back door. We had a little confab with the bank manager, and he said, actually, I'm not needing all this length of garden. How would it be if you were willing to build a brick wall across it? You could just take away the stones and make this yours. So we got that little garden, well, not for nothing, but say for £80 or something to build the wall. And the title deed was made up. And that expanded our world as well, because now we had a really nice lawn. And I had a place, of course, where we could grow lettuces, because it was a farm and we had to make that quarter acre work for us. And also it came complete with fruit bushes, lovely things like red gooseberries and yellow gooseberries, which were sweet, not the terrible green ones that other people grew. And red currants, which I'd never seen before. So there you are. See, money talks. They had a really good garden. I don't know, how would you explain the 60s? I was a member of the Youth Fellowship, and I took part in things in the town. The Lammas Fair came each year and took its fancies in the square. And there was a kind of round of things which happened in the town that everybody knew without them having to be sort of written out. The school had a gala in the month of June and went to a park which in those days was down on the North Road. I think it was called the Kirkgate Park. The Highland Games used to take place down there as well, but it was prone to flooding. So the town actually infilled part of Inverkeithing Bay. They were demolishing houses, remember, at the beginning of the 60s, and I think a lot of them just ended up there. And so they filled in half the bay and made a big running track and a kind of games area, and that became the site of the Highland Games year after year. Our bay was unusual. Dalgety Bay was idyllic. St Bridget's Kirk, the water's lapping, sand, you could go paddling. Our bay had this infill and little seawall. Then it had a paper mill which used esparto grass, and when they were cooking that you didn't half know it because you could smell it just like you could smell linoleum in Kirkcaldy. And when they were doing red paper, sometimes the bay ran red with effluent dye, and when they were doing green paper it ran green. You never knew which colour the water was to be. And beyond that, there was a quarry at Crookmess, and at regular times during the day a siren would go, followed by a thunderous explosion as lots of whinstone rock was brought down. At other times of the day a siren would go at the other side, at the end of Preston Crescent, and the other quarry would blast, and there would be a great avalanche of stones. We never noticed these things, but visitors to the town, I mean visitors from Edinburgh, were always quite astonished, just the way we would be astonished by the 1 o'clock gun going off. we just took it in our stride. So Inverkeithing was very much an industrial place. It was a very busy place too, because the traffic ran through the town and went down to Queensferry to get the ferries to Edinburgh. It was in 62 that the roadworks began. 64 the road and bridge were opened to Edinburgh, and after that the town became quieter in the middle. It did make an awful difference. Also around that time we got a new road from the end of the town out to Hill End and Dalgetty. Previously you'd gone along the road and turned down by the station and round Borland Road and then round to Hill End and Aberdour. Now at the north of the town, a road from Rosyth came down to Inverkeithing and they made it continue east straight across towards the coast to meet the Hill End Road. And again that acted as a bypass and sort of helped the town to be a bit quieter and a bit sleepier. But it wasn't sleepy in terms of enterprise. New houses were built for Glasgow overspill people. They came for new work which was being set up in Fife. And Dalgetty, of course, had new work, so people were coming in for that. And there was always a good train service, effectively trains every 20 minutes somewhere at some times. And that, of course, kept the town busy as well. Looking at my own childhood, I just had a little group of friends in the youth fellowship at the church and at the high school, and we just followed our own patterns. Looking back, people always say that 50s and 60s children were given tremendous freedom, and that's true. When we walked around to Dalgetty Bay, the actual bay before the town, there were one or two gun emplacements where you could play. Around at Crookness, there were a few gun emplacements, and up on the Ferry Hills. We never found any live ammunition, but we could have, and it quite astonishes me that we were allowed to do all these things. The aerodrome at Donnybristle, which was by Dalgetty Bay, closed, and it became a favourite place for people to take their teenagers in cars so they could practice driving on the old airfield. There was nothing to hit, you see, and it taught you how to drive in a straight line, except there were other teenagers careering about at all different angles, all with the same idea. I did, however, get proper lessons from a school in Dunfermline, but everybody had a go at driving on the airfield. I wouldn't say that the pop industry affected me much. I heard all the pop I needed on the radio, and I got a tape recorder. A tape recorder was good because you could record people and interview them, and that's part of my interest in history came from that as well. But I also had the sense to write down a lot of things, and I also learned to type at school. Actually, in the last 6 weeks of school, probably the most useful thing I learned. A note came round saying, I did get 8 O-levels and about 5 hires, but a note came round saying, if anyone wants to learn to type, they can get an excusal note from their usual timetable, and they can go to the typist's room and learn, you know, in the morning or afternoon. So I went along and did my typing, touch typing, for about 5 weeks before the school closed, and that, of course, set me up for life. Even today I can type on a computer, you know, reaching all the right keys immediately. Sometimes there are fumble mistakes. I really prefer the old typewriters. I always had a really good Olivetti or two, and I fairly hammered them. But I like that hard touch. This soft touch on computers is an awful nonsense now. Or am I getting old? I don't know. But the spell check's very useful. I know how to spell, but the computer doesn't. Anyway, I would say, looking back, it was quite a settled kind of life. My parents knew quite a lot of people who were friends for life, and they went way back. You know, histories were shared. from childhood, and they remembered various folks. So when I was speaking to them, they would be able to tell me who was who and who lived there and what happened. And I just seemed to absorb that without really consciously doing so.
George, would you tell me a bit more about the buildings in Inverkeithing, please?
Yes, Inverkeithing used to be a walled town. And if you start from the south, coming up from Queensferry, there's an area there called the Poplars, which was always puzzling to me. Poplars are big, long trees, but apparently in 1778 the town council had put poplar trees outside the town walls. Now these would be by old crofts, which we know from the Roods. There would be Addison's Yard, well these are 19th century names, Addison's Yards and Binning's Yard, and before that the Sick Man's Acre, and a place called Algier's Wynd or Dagger's Wynd, which used to go down to a little well at the bay, but then got blocked off, you may say, by the paper mill. But it was used by mill workers to go down through the allotments and along the back of the mill and into the front gate. Coming up to what was the town wall, the first thing you would notice was that there were tenements in Inverkeithing. That's something you wouldn't expect in a small borough town. You wouldn't get that in Couros. Remember I told you about the Glasgow overspill coming in 62? Well, they weren't the first. In 1912, when the dockyard was built, lots of people came to build the dockyard and develop the docks and grave out the docks and so on, and they had to be housed. So this big tenement was put in with 4 stories and 2 shops at the bottom. And then further up there was another tenement, and then you came to what would be the old town wall. On the left was the Corn Exchange. The Corn Exchange was built about the mid-1800s, I'm not quite sure. And then there's a little wynd going down to the mill, and that was just outside the old town wall. Within the wall there was a place called Ferguson House, which was a house with the 4 stairs, which I'd seen in 62 and photographed before it was demolished. And behind that there was a long row of houses and a courtyard in behind. That's now in Grieg Court, which goes on to Roman Road. Roman Road to the west was the way round the town if the gates were closed. And Roman Road became our road, which went past our farmhouse and later became Rood's Road. And so you could go round the town and bypass it if you had animals, you know, rather than through the town. Beyond Ferguson's house, there was a house going back to about the 1780s, and then some modern 19th century sandstone tenements with shops in them, hunters, grocers, another small shop. And then newer buildings. There was a post office building, which was a flat roofed building. And then there was a cafe, which was Mr. Taddy's. It had a jukebox, which was unusual and, you know, quite ambitious for the 60s. And it had our only neon sign outside in 2 colours, argon and neon. Oh, 3 colours, argon, neon and xenon, I think. It was, you may laugh, but that was going something for a small town. And it had a beautiful cafe at the back with a terrazzo floor and skylight windows and this jukebox, which was a great draw. Then there was a fruit shop, and then the Volunteers' Arms, which was a pub on the corner of Hill Street. Hill Street, or Dunfermline Wynd, went west up the hill and across Roman Road, and lo and behold, another set of tenements, Queen Mary Terrace, red sandstone, built about 1902 or 3 or 10, I don't know, somewhere around there, and another set of 2-storey, 3-storey buildings opposite. Really quite unusual. Going up Rood's Road, or Roman Road, the police station had been built in 1903, and then on the right was our farmhouse. and before us there were one or two weavers' cottages, but that was all that was on the outer part of the town. Continuing along the high street, there was a big grocer's, and then there was a chemist and a baby woolen shop, baby grow shop, in a 19th century building built in Whinstone. Then there was a National Commercial Bank, and then another shop, and then the Clydesdale Bank, which was built on the site of the Gala Tower. Another two-storey building with shops below and flats above. One was Gartshore's, the haberdashers and general clothing store. Can't remember the next one. And after that, there was a little pub, and further along the Queen's Hotel. And the Queen's Hotel actually had stables because that was an important thing in the early part of the 20th century. Beyond the Queen's Hotel there was Scott's Building, which is a very ancient building with a four-stair, and locals called it the Ark. It was really so old-fashioned. It was demolished in about 1903 in order, it's 1910, in order to make a new entry into the school, stairways and a little garden leading up to the school. And beyond that was Fordell's Lodging, which was a turreted townhouse of 3 stories that belonged to the Fordell family up the North Road. Beyond that there was a row of small white vernacular houses. The thing I remember most about that was Mrs. Cunningham had her sweet shop there, and I remember that we had to give coupons over the counter until about 1953 in order to get sweets. And one day Mum said to me, "There's no more rationing for sweets, so you can go and choose what you like." That's why I remember that. Going back to Taddy's Cafe, as you went in there was ice cream on one side and coffee and cakes. The ice cream was a threepenny cone, and I think if you maybe paid a little extra, or maybe you didn't, you got a little dip of raspberry sauce. But it was very, very seldom that we really stopped for ice cream. The habit of sort of eating ice cream every day when you were out just hadn't taken on. And it wasn't until about 1963 that the grocers opposite the Volunteer Arms became what we call a mini market, with a kind of serve yourself set out. Loaves were 11p halfpenny, which was quite a lot of money in those days. After Mrs. Cunningham's shop and a few little cottages, there was the Baptist church, and then a lane which went up steps, and the lane went up the north side of the school. So children used that quite a lot. And the next rood, I think, was called the Beltoe Rood. It was actually a field. There were 2 or 3 fields, and it belonged to a little farm called Rood Bank, which was set back from the road, and that was a market garden. Probably about 1890s, I would think, or earlier, judging by the sandstone house, but there were older buildings which are made of whinstone. You see, I'm using my knowledge of when quarries were opened and closed to very roughly date these. That was arable land until 1963, and then it was taken over by the town, and Rood's Crescent was built in there. The Beltoe Rood was a rood which was owned by the church, and we rented that, and the money which we paid included a teind or tenth, which went to the church's coffers to pay for a new piece of tow or rope on the bell. But really it was a way of financing the church. And we also paid teens to George Street in Edinburgh, to the Church of Scotland, for some of the land that we rented. Now these teens were round about 1 and threepence, which I think is sixpence in modern money, and these were paid to 121 George Street. That was some money back in the 1800s, but even in 1960s, you were spending the equivalent of about a penny halfpenny in modern money to send sixpence, you know, to send a postal order or something like that. So in 72, the government decreed that teens could be redeemed. I think you paid 8 times or 10 times the face value if you're teened, and after that it was written off. And a good thing too, because there's an awful lot of paperwork when you owned land and had all these things to fill in. Beyond the Rood Square, there was Allen Bank, which was a private house, and then St John's Church, which was a free church, United Free Church, that had moved away from the Church of Scotland in the 19th century or the late 18th century. It had a beautiful stone stairway, and it had metal railings and a metal arch with a central lamp, Victorian sort of style. After that, there was a doctor's house, which was a villa, which had its own consulting room and waiting room built onto the side. And the Labour Party hall was set in a little enclave, a little lay-by there. It was a wooden hut in those days, but very well kept. And then after that, you went up a road to Chapel Place, which used to be called the Loaning. By the end of Chapel Place, you had reached the road going along to Rosyth, and which now went on to Hill End. So that was the north of the town. And beyond that lay the Kirkgate Park on the Great North Road. And further up there was a horse trough on the right-hand side for horses and wagons that used that road going north. Coming back into town, on the left you would see a field which was above the railway station. That was called Croft Anree, the King's Croft. And there was also, I think, a manse for the St John's Church, I'm not sure, a big sandstone house opposite there. Then there was Borland Road, which went down and round to Hill End, across the railway. Then there was the entrance to the cinema. There was a big sort of canopy, and people sheltered under that. There was some stairs under, and then an asphalt path going down. And believe it or not, there was this almost open air shelter. It had walls for about 1.5 meters, and then pillars, and a kind of tin roof, and one 60-watt bulb. And people queued there waiting on the cinema opening, because the cinema might have opened at 6 on a Saturday night, and then there was another show at say 7:30 or 7:45. So people queued there quite happily, sometimes in the rain. The thing is that there's a certain animal warmth there, but there's also smoke. People smoked all the time, and it was really quite astonishing when you think back how smoky the cinema was, how smoky restaurants were, and so on. That's something that you would really notice if you went back in a time machine. Beyond the cinema, which is a very nice building with a sort of Art Deco frontage, 2 square towers and 2 domes on top of the towers, there was a big old building which was called the Model Lodging House. And this was one of these lodging houses that had been there for navvies who were grading out the dockyards. Now it was used as a factory, and it made, I think, plastic raincoats, and it took on the name Modo. Further along there was another tenement with shops that had the Co-op dairy, but before that there were 2 temporary buildings, just wooden huts really with tin roofs, and that's where James Murray had his fish shop, and the fish shop had slabs in the window for the fish, and across the middle of the window there was a pipe, and on very hot days they turned on the water, and water dribbled down the window to keep the display cool. Refrigeration was really not known except along at the butcher's shop, where they had a walk-in refrigerator about maybe 6 or 8 meters square. but that was the only refrigerator really in town. After Mr. Murray's fish shop, his brother had a stationery and newspaper shop, also in a temporary tin hut. When I look at it, I think that area was designated for another tenement like the one that was further along, but it never got built, probably because the cinema was doing too well and wouldn't sell out. Beyond the second tenement, rather to your surprise, there was a very steep road going down the brae, down to the Keithing Burn. And it had Dunlop Terrace, which was 4 bays of tenements built down the road, facing north-south. Really beautiful buildings, but very, very steep road. You wouldn't really want to, well, nobody had a car, but if you had a car, you wouldn't want to take the car down the road or up the road on an icy day. But it shows the pressure there was to build, for people in the 1910s in the town. Round the corner, at the top of the tenement, there was a small workshop and garage, and then Heriot Street, which had what was meant to be the house that belonged to a relative of Dr Livingstone. There's lots of myths and tales told about that, but it wasn't Dr Livingstone's house. There is some connection though. Coming along the main street, there was the grammar school, which was a sandstone building with a dome. And then next to that, the church, 14th century tower, rebuilt about 1825 with a perpendicular styled windows, nicely designed inside. Only a balcony at the back. There was loft room, to put a balcony all the way around, but it was never really needed. The church had some of the earliest stained glass windows from, I think, Germany. The big east window was a bit of a novelty at the time it was put in the 1820s. And other stained glass windows have been added since, including the most recent one, which commemorates the paper mill and Mr Johnson, who came in 1938 and was there till about 1980s as minister. He was there all my time, which is quite a record. Beyond the church, there was Holborn House, which is a fairly nondescript looking tenement, but I think it has quite a history, and another small house, and then on the corner a building which we knew as the Cadora Cafe. There were lots of cafes and fish and chip shops in the towns. There was Taddy's, the Cadora, and in Town Hall Street there was DeVito's fish and chip shop, which I think had coal-fired fish fryers. And I believe in the 30s they had a phonograph with a big horn, playing Italian records in the corner because the owner was Italian and liked to hear the great Caruso sing as he battered the fish. There is a legend that somebody put a poke of peas down the horn and muffled it. And the owner said, "Whop up the peas down the gramophone horn and stop at the singing of the great Caruso." But that may just be a myth. Further along, there was a nice building which was a stationer's called Renix, and it had an almost English-looking bay window, just obviously an old house which had been done up nicely. Facing the square, looking south, there was a big emporium, Kennewy's tea, wines and fancy goods kind of grocers. And just at the side of that building there was a great metal trunk going up, obviously carrying cables, because this was the telephone exchange for the town. And it was built probably about 1900s, upstairs. The paper mill was Inverkeithing 1, our farm was 114, and the chemist was 26. So obviously these are early adopters of the telephone. That telephone exchange continued till about 1962. But in 1942, in the middle of the war, people were getting anxious about bombing because we were in a fair target area with the Forth Bridge and the dockyard. And the engineers put in a new cable along Rouge Road where we lived, and built a concrete blockhouse diagonally opposite us, which was a new telephone exchange that carried all the dockyard lines. And in the event of the High Street being bombed, they would have just switched over to these lines. So the whole set of lines was installed in conduits under the road, and which was then laid properly as a road with, pavements. And after the war, in '63, that became the new automatic telephone exchange because all the cables were already there, so it was easy to switch that back. Coming down the High Street from the north, on the east side, the seaside, Providence House, I think 1688, God's Providence is my inheritance. Then there was Aitchison House, which was burned down in a big fire, so a stone from that is now put up on the facade of an extension to the Borough Arms, and it's got a 16-something date and 1888 written above. Then there's the Borough Arms Hotel. The fire obviously had cleared quite a bit of that because there's a sandstone building with a kind of Venetian balcony projecting out with a bay window, which was Mrs. Mercer's fruit shop. There was a small grocer's called Dick's Cooperative Society. That was an independent cooperative, and not to be confused with the cooperative dairy, which was further along at Dunlop Terrace, because that was a sort of national Scottish cooperative. The little sandstone building actually made quite a good backdrop on the square for the crowning of the Gala Queen, because every year a girl was chosen as a Gala Queen, and a stage was set up there, and there are lots of pictures in the Friary of the Gala Queens being crowned and the coronation. Beyond that, there was the Royal Hotel. The Royal Hotel was renovating itself in 1962, and they dug up the floor and they discovered that there was a well underneath. It had been a courtyard, and then they'd built forward obviously in the 1800s. So they reinstated the well and left it in the floor as a wishing well when they renovated the building. Beyond that, there were several sort of ordinary kind of shops. There was also a small shop for the Dunfermline Cooperative Funeral Service. It had a sign with its name and number, and that someone was in attendance or could come down and interview people if they had a funeral to arrange. That was something that was done on the High Street. You didn't need to go all the way to Dunfermline. And then beyond that was the 1688 building that my uncle had as a store with the small windows. And after that you went on to Queen Street, which had various buildings, and then the Friary, which was an ancient building with a big stone stair and massive vaults. Facing up the square north, there was a building which was my uncle's ironmonger's shop, the hardware store, and it had been renovated in the 1880s. It has a flat upstairs and a shop downstairs. Today it's a locksmith's. I worked in that shop, went from the time I was 16 till about 22 or so in the summer and in the winter. So I got to know lots of people who came in as customers. One couple came in quite a lot in 62, 63, and they, I knew, had bought an old dilapidated building in Town Hall Street called Thompson's House. And they were doing it up, and they were going to do it up as a proper renovation like the ones in Couros. Now Thompson's House had a close, you could go in and through and end up in a croft in the back, and there was a ducat further down, and that was a little farm in itself. You could have driven cattle through that close, and then in through the door there was a stone stairway and mullioned stone window, which must go back a long way, and up at the top of that stairway, on the third story, there was a little cap house like you get in Couros. There was a two-story building and then a little turret house at the top. Inside, about maybe 3 metres in, there were arcades. So obviously this building had been set back from the road, just like the Royal Hotel had been, and then had built out later. There were 2 stones on that house, except Lord bless the house, they labour in vain that build it, and another one, care not, care but inordinarily, which is up on the lintel on the first floor. Now, Mr. and Mrs. Finlay, who did up that building, were very, very enthusiastic about getting it restored properly and getting it put right. And they came in and were talking to me about it, and I expressed an interest, and they were good enough to invite me and lots of others to a hogmanay party one year, once they were in, a kind of housewarming. And they had electric light, of course, and so on, but they also had a log fire. And I remember sort of, yes, late at night, there were 1 or 2 lamps on, but 1 or 2 candles, and there was a fiddler sitting in the corner playing music, just lazily, and a few couples just dancing, but, you know, just lazily. They were much more mellow because we're getting into New Year. And I looked round at the flickering firelight and the fiddler, and apart from the fact they were dressed in 60s clothes, it could have been the 1760s. It was really, really nice to be there in that setting. And that was a house that had always had my interest. The close was open and anyone could wander in, and the back garden was derelict. And I'd photographed that too. And it was so nice to see it being renovated. But if only other houses in the town had been done at that time. One down King Street, 17th century, Ferguson's house with the 4 stairs. It would have been wonderful, but alas, it was not to be. Going down Hope Street from the High Street, there was a small modern inset building, which was a stationer's. Then there was Niven's butcher's shop. It was a big whinstone building with ashlar sandstone on the corners, and it had the walk-in refrigerator inside. It was a properly set out butcher's shop with steel yard arms, you know, to hold meat, and it had tiles set in on the side of the windows and the shop windows, and tiled walls, and sawdust on the floor. A typical butcher's shop. And of course carcasses hanging open to the air and any passing blue bottles. I don't think they had any of these ultraviolet lights that kill blue bottles in those days. It really makes you think. The other famous thing in that department was Aggie Moody's shop. She had a nice sweet shop with a nice display and all the hundreds and thousands of bonbons, you know, in a big tray in the window. But very often her ginger Tom was ensconced there enjoying the sunshine.
Could I just ask, is Thompson's house, Thompson's house?
Thompson's house, yes.
Is it still there?
Yes, of course.
Oh, very good.
And next to it there was the music hall. The music hall was a sort of institution. It had been a kind of public hall, and it had been a British restaurant during the war. It was a dilapidated old place. Everything was dilapidated in the 50s, and I did have some aesthetic sense, and I sort of used to say to my parents, why can this place not be painted, or why has our house got such old-fashioned brass switches? I'm sure I'm getting a shock of this brass switch. And they said, oh no, it's the war, you see, we haven't had time, we haven't had money to do anything like that. And luckily one day Dad got a shock off the brass switch on a very wet day, and the electrician was called. And when I came back from school, the first thing I noticed was there was a white plastic switch just at the bottom of the stairs. And I dropped my school bag and I raced up to the top, switched on the light, raced up to the top, and lo, there was a white plastic switch at the top of the stairs. And I realised, never again will I have this tingling shock when I'm going up and down the stairs. And well, it was the same in the music hall. It was painted cream, and green of course it might be, and the stage was kind of rickety, and there were 2 kind of old metal shades as stage lights with 200-watt screw-in bulbs. That was state of the art in those days. And when it was full of people, the walls kind of ran with condensation because there was no forced ventilation or air conditioning or anything like that. But that's just what it was like. And St John's Hall was like that too. But what I remember from the music hall was going into a pantomime or a Christmas show for children. And it was very good, but it was very crowded and very stuffy. And actually, although it was good, and I was really glad to get away from it. So the music hall got demolished about 1963 or 4, and Thompson's house built a little garage and an extension in stone frontage. And that was good because next to it was the old bank house, also in Town Hall Street, just next to Providence House. And the bank house was made of yellow sandstone. It had a big arched doorway and a double wooden door with a postern gate in it. So normally visiting a house just opened the postern gate, but you could open the 2 double doors and drive in, and there were garages and a courtyard there. I believe there were quite good vaults underneath the building as well, but I never saw them, but I knew that they existed. That was one of the early banks in the town. And then there was Providence House. St John's Hall was next to St John's Church on the other end of town. It also was ambitious but sort of simple. It had a hallkeeper's house upstairs. Downstairs it had just a big room and a stage, and I don't even know if there's a dressing room. Maybe there was just a bit of space beside the stage behind a curtain. But there were some great shows put on there. The BBs put on a good show, and the Youth Fellowship there put on a good show, and their concerts were the highlight of the year through the 60s. That was something that, again, we just took for granted. We never thought about it. Normally we would go to the cinema locally, the Majestic, or we'd take the bus up to Dunfermline, where there was a Regal and another cinema for the bigger shows like South Pacific and the bigger shows that came out at that time. The coming of stereo sound was really quite an eye-opener in the 60s because we'd never heard anything like that. And loudspeakers at the side of the cinema, so that when this plane came in over, well, we heard it before we saw it, and then the plane came in over our heads onto the screen, flying into this Pacific island. It was really quite incredible. It's very difficult to explain how exciting things were, like stereo sound, record players that you could carry, and portable radios. After one particularly good harvest, Dad bought a small portable radio with microvalves, and it used 67.5 volt batteries. That was rather special. It was usually 90 volt and 1.5. But these microvalves, you see, didn't need so much voltage. Valves always needed voltage. And it worked off the mains in the living room, but believe it or not, you could lift it up and put it in the car and take it away on picnics. And you may laugh, it kind of weighed about 5 kilos, but that was going some for that age. And also it was done in a nice leatherette, as was Gordon's Dansette record player. Colour was coming in. You had the distinct impression in the 60s that everything happened in black and white because you saw black and white movies and pictures of the war in black and white. And then suddenly, in around about 62, 63, colour came. And lo and behold, the bank manager, who was a friend of ours, of course across the wall, invited us down to see the first colour television, which I think was showing Sir Winston Churchill's funeral. That was the first time I saw colour TV. We didn't have a television until 66, as I said, and then we got a decent one in 70. But that was when Dad was more or less retiring. So that just shows how unimportant television was in our life. Now, going back to the Hope Street, after Nivens, There was Adam Walks, who was the other ironmongers, and he had a really good display of fancy goods. If you wanted to buy casseroles, or if you wanted to buy a stool or something, a step ladder or something like that, he had these bigger pieces of ironmongery. And then after that was a doctor's surgery. In Queen Street at the back, in 63 or 62, the new Civic Centre was built. And that was a great step forward, because it had a really decent hall with a good stage and a few dressing rooms and things, so proper concerts could be held. And the church hired that to have their annual sale of work. And in those days, sales of work were opened not just by the minister, but by a little committee of dignitaries that sat up on the stage. Things were very much more formal, if you know what I mean. And these formalities were all terribly important. But that's just the way it was. But the sale of work always was a great event and did very well. After the Civic Centre, there was another building which actually I think was the bookies, and then you came to the ridge which marked where the town hall was, and then down to the Corn Exchange, and then a few tenements called the Poplars, and then the little allotments and Anger's Wine going down to the mill. There were a few villas out of town, but further down was Rich Now. Now that was a small community, again tenements, and well-built tenements, about 1910, 1912, and one or two shops there too. Mainly more specialist shops. Somebody who sold Maxim light bulbs had a shop for a while. They used it as a depot. A man who did shoe repairs had a workshop down there. A, he had the space, and B, there was room to park, which there wouldn't have been in the high street where it used to be, you see. So you went down there with your shoes and left them and got them repaired. And that was Mr. Prentice. He stopped work, I think, about 1980s. And actually I went down to photograph, well, to get a few things from his workshop on behalf of Dunfermline Museum, just to take them up and put them in his collection. They said to me, for goodness sake, don't accept any lasts. Shoemakers are always wanting to give you lasts. What we want are metal signs saying use Kiwi root polish, or old packaging, you know, for shoelaces, or ancient tubs of whitening for tennis shoes, you know, all the things that shopkeepers said, oh, that's old stuff, you don't want that, that's just dross, we have to write it off. That's exactly what museums do want, not the everyday thing. So that's sort of a quick walk around the town. It was good to be able to know these people who were renovating houses, and in the 60s there was a spirit of renovation rather than constantly making things new. The borough, the Civic Centre was a beautiful building, very well designed, and had a beautiful little courtyard. But it's just a small point. People commented about the lights. The lights were very jazzy and up to the minute, 60s, but they all used what we would now call micro Edison fittings. In other words, you couldn't get the bulbs. Nowadays you can go into a supermarket and get a tiny little candle bulb with a miniature Edison fitting, and most modern IKEA lamps are Edison fitting. But these had to be imported from somewhere. You know, when the bulbs started to go, they found that it was an architect's dream, but it wasn't practical. They'd been far better putting in 5-foot tubes in pretty shades, but never mind.
You still go back to Inverkeithing occasionally, don't you?
Yes.
Could you tell me what changes you've seen since the 1960s and how you feel about them?
Well, the last time I was there, I noticed that, like all town centres, it's become much more down at heel. The dockyard has closed, well, more or less, and Donnybristle closed in 63, and a lot of industry has gone from the town. The paper mill closed about 2000 and something. It was a great employer. And now it's just a derelict site. And what a pity that they haven't done something to develop the waterfront there. But you see, it's contaminated land. It's got esparto grass, it's got dyes, it's got all sorts of things, and it costs an awful lot of money to renovate. And you've still got a ship not a shipbreaking yard, but a scrap yard where the Ward's shipbreaking yard was. And nobody's going to build a fancy hotel down there. It's too far away from the station anyway, and there isn't a bus route to it, if you see what I mean. So, alas, it's derelict. If they even just ploughed it and then planted it with meadows and some mature trees, it would be rather nice. The high street has an awful lot of thrift shops. Montrose does too, but Montrose is better. We have 2 really good quality butchers. We did have 2 fishmongers, now we have 1, and we still had 1 or 2 independent stores until last year. You know, we're really pretty good up here. Inverkeithing used to be like that. You could get everything you wanted on the high street except curtains and bed linen. You go to Dunfermline and there's a very, very good bus service. And of course you could go to Edinburgh, there's very good train service. But no, it looks a wee bit down at heel and sad. It's trying hard. Down at the new houses behind the Crescent, they put in where Fraser Avenue was, they put in a railing which commemorates the paper making machines and so on. So they're doing their best. But really, there isn't the money there isn't the industry that there used to be. But of course that's a problem all over Scotland just now.
George, thank you very much for all your testimony so far. Is there anything else you would like to discuss?
Well, I think there's a question of methodology, if I can put it that way. As I said early on, I was lucky to have a stern but very useful taskmaster with Eric Simpson, who's written some excellent books about Fife and Scotland. And he always said, yes, very good, but where and what? And then can you think why and how does it fit in? And you have to keep these things in the back of your mind when you're taking pictures. Often we set off to take pictures just for ourselves because we like a building that we knew in our youth. But when it becomes more serious, try and have a method of filing things. Now, back in the 80s, I used to speak with Eric and other people, and if they wanted pictures or something, we had a kind of free market. I would give them a picture and they would give me a picture and we copied it. So we had good photography and we could do that. And there was no problems. When other people wrote, I tended to say, well, can you give me, as it were, £3 to cover the cost and postage? Because otherwise you were forever getting something specially done for them. And actually, I even got a little rubber stamp saying copyright of George Hastie, because that was in the 80s. And I had put a lot of stuff into Dunfermline Library and Museum, and I had retained copyright. I'm actually thinking seriously of writing to them and officially saying I waive copyright nowadays, because it's different days. With computers, of course, people can, and with modern cameras, people can copy anything anywhere. And I've actually downloaded things from the internet, maps of industrial works near Rosyth and Inverkeithing in the 1880s or something. I'd never seen that map, but I saw it and thought, that's for me. Pressed the button, got a screenshot. Other people will be doing that too. So get rid of the idea of copyright and owning. It's nice to have a body of work. It's nice to spend even years putting it together, but always bear in mind that it will be time to pass this over to a collection. When I left Fife in 1998, I thought there's no use me paying removal men to take 3 boxes of stuff up north and then have to post it down south or drive it down south. So I made things over to Dunfermline Library and some more to National Museums of Scotland, and gave them not literally a ton of stuff, but a few good box files of stuff, and they were very happy with it. And I was looking through the receipts the other day actually, and I was astonished what I'd given them. Part of me felt, oh gosh, did I bother them with that, or did I bother them with that? But no, they were really quite happy because it helped to make up the story. I even have a letter from a northern museum that thanked me for Sunday school material and things from early days. He said, we are having a section on Sunday schools and church life, and the museum down south has asked us if we want this for our collection. This is just perfect. This is just the thing we want. Now that doesn't mean that you keep absolutely everything and hand over every crisp packet that you've ever eaten from, but when you take a good core of organised work, if you can match it to a map so that this picture is where 1 is on the map and this picture is where 62 is on the map, that's one method. If you can just have a good index and something written on the back. Be careful though, if you're writing on the back of photographs, make sure you have the right kind of ink and it doesn't stain. And also, go and get acetate sleeves. W.H. Smith sells cheap sleeves, and they sell ones that are almost twice as expensive. The more expensive ones are what you want. Keep things clean, keep things neat, don't fold things, put them in ring files, label them. And then, even if you get knocked down by the proverbial bus, someone can come and collect them and, as it were, have them on one shelf saying, for the museum. When you get to 75, you have to think about these things. But no, I would say to anyone who, like me, has started to be interested in the passing scene, don't think something's too banal or ordinary. Don't think something's too modern for people to be interested. People one day will be fascinated by what you've got. Even your early computers, they'll just think it's gold dust. So think ahead and think what you can store, and always who, where, when, what, and maybe even why. And then you'll have a good collection and other people will be inspired to look about them.
Fantastic advice, George.
Thank you.
I endorsed that fully. Thank you. I think that's all my questions for now. Is there anything else you would like to add?
No, I think I've said enough. I'm ready for a cup of tea. Are you?
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Delight. Thank you.